The morning sun cast long shadows through the tall windows of courtroom 304, where Judge William Harrison sat with perfect posture in his black robe. His silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses gave him an air of authority that matched his 20 years on the bench. It was 9:15 a.m. on a Tuesday, and like every other day, he prepared to handle the morning's traffic violations with mechanical efficiency. The wooden benches were filled with the usual mix of frustrated citizens, all waiting for their turn to explain why they shouldn't have to pay their tickets. Judge Harrison barely looked up as he called out the next case number, his voice echoing through the high-ceilinged room. Case number 247, Dr. Maya Bennett. A woman in her mid-40s stood up from the third row. She wore a deep purple blazer over a cream-colored blouse, with her natural hair styled in neat, professional twists. Around her neck hung a silver pendant shaped like the African continent. She carried a leather briefcase filled with papers and photographs, evidence she hoped would explain her situation. As Dr. Bennett walked to the podium, her heels clicked softly against the polished floor. The sound barely registered with Judge Harrison, who was already shuffling through her file without making eye contact. He had seen hundreds of cases like this. Someone parked where they shouldn't have, and now they had a story about why the rules shouldn't apply to them. You're charged with parking in a restricted zone on Cedar Street last Thursday at 2:45 p.m. How do you plead? His tone was flat, uninterested, already assuming he knew how this would play out. Your Honor, while I acknowledge that I did park there, I would like to explain the circumstances, Dr. Bennett began, her voice steady and articulate. She reached into her briefcase to pull out some documents. Judge Harrison's eyes finally flicked up, but only briefly. He noticed her expensive-looking blazer and made another assumption, that she was probably some entitled person who thought the rules didn't apply to her. He cut her off before she could continue. The sign clearly states no parking, historical district access only. The fine is $250. He started writing on his form, ready to move on to the next case. Dr. Bennett tried again. Yes, Your Honor, I understand that. However, I was there conducting official research for the city's Historical Preservation Committee. I have documentation here from. Miss Bennett. Judge Harrison interrupted, emphasizing the Ms., despite the doctor clearly written on her citation. The rules about parking in historical districts are very clear. They're in place to protect important cultural landmarks from tourist traffic. I'm sure whatever photos you wanted to take could have been done from a legal parking spot. The dismissive tone in his voice made several heads turn in the courtroom. A few observers exchanged knowing looks, all too familiar with this kind of treatment. But Dr. Bennett remained composed, though her fingers tightened slightly around the papers she held. What Judge Harrison failed to notice was the way other court officials were reacting to his treatment of Dr. Bennett. The court clerk, Mrs. Rodriguez, who had processed Dr. Bennett's paperwork earlier, was frowning deeply. The bailiff shifted uncomfortably, recognizing Dr. Bennett from her recent appearance on the local news. Just as Judge Harrison was about to formally enter the fine into the record, the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom opened. Dr. James Peterson, head of the city's Historical Society, walked in with a stack of preservation documents. He spotted Dr. Bennett at the podium and smiled broadly. Dr. Bennett, I'm so glad I caught you. The board is extremely excited about your findings regarding the Underground Railroad safe house on Cedar Street. Your documentation is going to be crucial for the landmark designation hearing next week. Judge Harrison's pen stopped moving. For the first time that morning, he truly looked at the woman standing before him. The courtroom had gone quietly tense, like the moment before a thunderclap. The story was just beginning, and Judge Harrison had no idea that his next few minutes would change not only his perspective, but the entire way he approached his duties on the bench. His comfortable world of black and white justice was about to become considerably more complicated. Judge Harrison's courtroom fell into an uncomfortable silence. The words Underground Railroad safe house hung in the air like heavy smoke. He glanced down at the papers in front of him, then back at Dr. Bennett, trying to process this new information while maintaining his authoritative demeanor. Dr. Peterson, she said warmly, turning to face her colleague, I was just trying to explain to Judge Harrison about our preservation project. Her voice carried no hint of accusation, though several people in the courtroom noticed how she emphasized the word doctor that the judge had ignored earlier. Dr. Peterson, a tall man with gray speckled beard and round glasses, walked to the front of the courtroom. He carried himself with the comfortable authority of someone used to speaking in academic settings. Your Honor, Dr. Bennett is leading our city's most important historical research project in decades. She's documenting previously unknown Underground Railroad locations in our district. Judge Harrison cleared his throat, buying time to adjust his approach. The morning's routine traffic court had suddenly become something entirely different. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the courtroom watching him, waiting to see how he would handle this revelation. "I see," he said, though it was clear he was still trying to understand the situation. "However, the parking regulations in the historical district are still in place for a reason." Dr. Bennett opened her briefcase and pulled out several official-looking documents. "Your Honor, I have here the City Council's authorization for our research team to access restricted areas." She placed the papers on the clerk's desk. "We're racing against time because the building at 427 Cedar Street is scheduled for renovation next month. If we don't document its historical features now, crucial evidence of our city's role in the Underground Railroad could be lost forever." Mrs. Rodriguez, the court clerk, quickly reviewed the documents and nodded to the judge. "These appear to be in order, Your Honor. The authorization is signed by Mayor Thompson himself." Judge Harrison felt the confidence in his initial judgment beginning to crack. He had assumed Dr. Bennett was just another person making excuses, but now he faced the uncomfortable reality that his assumptions had nearly interfered with an important historical project. "The building has hidden rooms and marking systems that match known Underground Railroad sites," Dr. Peterson added. "Dr. Bennett is one of only 3 experts in the country qualified to authenticate these features. She's published extensively on African American history and architecture during the Civil War era." The judge looked more carefully at Dr. Bennett now, noticing details he had overlooked before. The briefcase wasn't just expensive, it was worn in a way that suggested years of academic work. The papers she carried weren't hastily gathered excuses, but carefully organized research documents. Her composure wasn't entitlement, but professional dignity. "Your Honor," Dr. Bennett spoke again, her voice measured and clear, "I understand and respect the parking regulations. They protect our historical sites from damage and overcrowding. However, my team needs close access to properly document these buildings before they're altered. We're not tourists taking photos, we're preserving crucial pieces of American history." Several people in the courtroom nodded in agreement. A young law student in the back row was furiously taking notes, sensing she was watching something significant unfold. Judge Harrison found himself in an unusual position. For 20 years, he had prided himself on quick, efficient judgments. Now, he realized how dangerous such quick judgments could be. He looked at the clock on the wall. Only 10 minutes had passed since he first called Dr. Bennett's case, but it felt much longer. "Dr. Bennett," he said finally, emphasizing her proper title this time, "would you please approach the bench with Dr. Peterson? I believe we need to discuss this matter in more detail." His voice had lost its dismissive tone, replaced by something closer to respect. As Dr. Bennett and Dr. Peterson stepped forward, the rest of the courtroom watched with interest. The morning's routine traffic court had become an unexpected lesson in assumptions, expertise, and the importance of looking beyond first impressions. And for Judge Harrison, it was only the beginning of a much larger awakening. At the judge's bench, Dr. Bennett spread out a series of photographs that made Judge Harrison's eyes widen. The images showed intricate markings carved into old wooden beams, hidden spaces behind walls, and what appeared to be a narrow tunnel entrance beneath floorboards. Each photo was carefully labeled with measurements and historical notes. "These markings," Dr. Bennett explained quietly, matched the documented patterns used by Underground Railroad conductors in the 1850s. They're identical to symbols found in confirmed safe houses in Philadelphia and Baltimore. Her finger traced the peculiar marks in one photo. This house on Cedar Street might have helped hundreds of people escape to freedom. Judge Harrison leaned forward, his earlier arrogance replaced by genuine interest. "How did you discover this location?" he asked, his voice now carrying respect rather than dismissal. "We found references to it in the diary of Sarah Thompson, a local abolitionist." Dr. Peterson joined in. Dr. Bennett spent 6 months cross-referencing property records and comparing architectural features before identifying this building. She's been featured in the Historical Society's journal 3 times for similar discoveries. The rest of the courtroom remained quiet, straining to hear the conversation. Mrs. Rodriguez, the clerk, had stopped pretending to organize her files and was openly watching the discussion. The young law student in the back had moved to a closer bench, still taking detailed notes. Your Honor, Dr. Bennett continued, pulling out another document. This is tomorrow's schedule for the National Cultural Heritage Conference. I'm giving the keynote speech about preserving African American historical sites in urban areas. She pointed to her name on the program, where her impressive credentials were listed. PhD from Harvard, 15 years of research experience, author of 4 books on cultural preservation. Judge Harrison felt his face grow warm as he read through her qualifications. Just 30 minutes ago, he hadn't even bothered to use her proper title. Now he was learning that she was one of the country's leading experts in her field. The renovation company has given us only 2 weeks to complete our documentation, Dr. Bennett explained. That's why I needed to park close to the building. We're using sensitive equipment to scan the walls and floors, looking for more hidden spaces. Every minute counts. A photographer from the local newspaper, who happened to be in court for another case, quietly took pictures of the 3 figures huddled at the bench. He knew a good story when he saw one. Dr. Bennett, Judge Harrison said, straightening in his chair, I believe I owe you an apology. My initial handling of your case was inappropriate. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I made assumptions that were not only wrong but potentially harmful to important historical research. The courtroom had grown so quiet that people could hear the old clock ticking on the wall. Many observers nodded in approval at the judge's admission. Your Honor, Dr. Bennett responded graciously, would you like to visit the site yourself? Seeing these historical features in person helps people understand why preservation is so crucial. Her offer was genuine, without a hint of smugness or revenge. Judge Harrison found himself nodding. I would like that very much, he said. Then, raising his voice to address the full courtroom, he announced, the parking violation against Dr. Bennett is dismissed. Furthermore, I'm recommending to the City Council that special parking permits be issued for verified historical research teams. Dr. Peterson smiled broadly while Dr. Bennett began gathering her photographs. The young law student in the audience wrote down one final note. Justice comes in many forms. As word of the morning's events spread through the courthouse, Judge Harrison sat quietly at his bench, thinking about how close he had come to hindering an important historical project simply because he refused to look past his first impressions. The weight of his gavel felt different now, heavier with responsibility. The revelations of the morning weren't just about hidden rooms and secret tunnels. They were about the hidden prejudices that could blind even those tasked with delivering justice. The next morning, Judge Harrison stood before the old brick building on Cedar Street, its weathered facade hiding secrets that had waited more than 150 years to be discovered. He had arrived early for the site visit, dressed not in his usual court robes but in casual clothes that made him look more like a curious tourist than a judge. Dr. Bennett arrived precisely on time, carrying her research equipment in a large canvas bag. She was accompanied by 2 graduate students who carefully handled measuring tools and a sophisticated scanning device. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cracked sidewalk as they approached the building's entrance. Good morning, Your Honor. Dr. Bennett greeted him warmly. Thank you for taking time to visit our research site. She pulled out an old brass key and unlocked the heavy wooden door. This building has been a grocery store, an apartment complex, and most recently, a storage facility. But its most important role was hidden from public records. As they stepped inside, the musty smell of old wood and aged brick filled the air. Dust particles danced in the sunbeams that streamed through dirty windows. Judge Harrison noticed how Dr. Bennett's eyes lit up as she began pointing out details he would have missed entirely on his own. See these marks near the baseboards? She knelt down, shining a flashlight on what looked like random scratches. They're actually directional signals. Escaped slaves would look for these marks to find safe hiding places. She ran her fingers gently over the worn grooves. Each mark had a specific meaning: danger, safety, food, water. One of the graduate students carefully measured the markings while the other took detailed photographs. Judge Harrison watched in fascination as they worked with the precision of forensic investigators. Over here, Dr. Bennett continued, leading him to what appeared to be an ordinary closet. We found something remarkable. She pushed aside a loose floorboard, revealing a narrow passage below. This tunnel connected to the basement of the church 3 blocks away. People seeking freedom could move between safe houses without being seen on the streets. Judge Harrison crouched down to look into the passage, trying to imagine the courage it took to crawl through such a tight space in complete darkness. "How many people do you think passed through here?" he asked quietly. "Based on the diary entries we found, at least 200, Dr. Bennett replied. Each person represented a family's hopes for freedom. Every successful escape changed not just one life, but generations to come. The graduate students had set up their scanning equipment, which used special technology to look through walls and floors. The machine screen showed ghostly images of spaces hidden behind the old plaster. Without this documentation, Dr. Bennett explained, the renovation crew would never know what they're destroying. These walls contain American history as important as any battlefield or presidential home. She showed him the detailed maps they were creating, marking every hidden room and secret passage. Judge Harrison thought about how quickly he had dismissed her in court the day before. Now he understood that she wasn't just conducting research, she was preserving crucial pieces of American history that could have been lost forever. "The construction company has agreed to work around the historical features," Dr. Bennett said, "but only because we can show them exactly what needs to be protected. Every day of research matters." As they moved through the building, Dr. Bennett shared stories she had uncovered about the families who had owned the house, the brave conductors who had guided escaped slaves to freedom, and a complex network of safe houses that had once filled their city. Judge Harrison listened intently, asking thoughtful questions. He realized that his courtroom, with its rigid rules and quick judgments, was just a small part of a much larger story. The true meaning of justice went far beyond parking violations and traffic tickets. "Dr. Bennett," he said finally, watching her team work, "I believe I need to learn more about our city's history. Would you recommend some books to help me start?" Her smile was warm and genuine. "I'd be happy to share my reading list, Your Honor. It's never too late to discover new perspectives on old stories." That evening, Judge Harrison sat alone in his chambers long after the courthouse had emptied. Files from the past month's cases covered his desk, each one open to reveal his hastily written notes and decisions. The setting sun cast long shadows across the room as he reviewed case after case, seeing his own prejudices clearly for the first time. He picked up a yellow legal pad and began making notes. In the past month alone, he had given harsher fines to minority defendants for the same violations that earned white defendants warnings. He had interrupted women more frequently than men during their testimonies. He had dismissed explanations without fully listening, just as he had almost done with Dr. Bennett. 20 years on the bench, he muttered to himself, running a hand through his silver hair. How many times have I been wrong? How many people have I failed to truly hear? His computer screen showed Dr. Bennett's impressive biography on the university's website. Multiple awards, published books, international recognition for her work in historical preservation. Yet he had seen none of that when she stood before him. He had only seen what he expected to see. The judge pulled out his phone and dialed a number he rarely used. After 3 rings, a familiar voice answered. "Sarah, it's your father. Do you have time to talk?" His daughter, a civil rights attorney in another state, was surprised by his call. They hadn't spoken much since she criticized his handling of a racial bias case last year. "Dad, is everything okay? I met someone today who made me think about some of the things you've been trying to tell me," he said slowly, "about assumptions and privilege and really listening to people." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "What happened?" Sarah asked, her voice softening with curiosity. Judge Harrison spent the next 30 minutes telling her about Dr. Bennett, the Underground Railroad site, and his realization about his own biases. His daughter listened quietly, only interrupting occasionally to ask questions. "You know," Sarah said finally, "this is exactly what I've been talking about. These biases affect everything, even in our justice system, especially in our justice system." "I know that now," he replied, "or at least I'm starting to understand. Sarah, I think I owe you an apology too. I should have listened better when you tried to explain these things before." After ending the call with his daughter, Judge Harrison returned to his desk. He opened his laptop and began typing a memo to the court administrator. The subject line read, "Proposal for Judicial Bias Training Program." As he wrote, his mind kept returning to the hidden marks in the old house on Cedar Street, How many other important things had been hidden right in front of him, simply because he hadn't bothered to look closely enough? A knock on his office door interrupted his thoughts. It was Mrs. Rodriguez, the court clerk, about to leave for the day. "Your Honor, I found those old case files you asked for." She placed a thick stack of folders on his desk. "Thank you, Maria," he said, using her first name for perhaps the first time in their 15 years working together. "Would you mind staying a few minutes? I'd like your honest opinion about some changes I'm considering for our courtroom procedures." Mrs. Rodriguez looked surprised but pleased. She sat down across from him, and for the next hour, they discussed ways to make the court more fair and welcoming to all citizens. When she finally left, Judge Harrison remained at his desk, surrounded by case files and filled with determination. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, he would really listen. Tomorrow, he would look past his first impressions. On his desk, Dr. Bennett's academic profile was still open on his computer screen, a reminder that expertise and excellence could come in any form. The judge had spent his career making quick judgments, but now he understood that true justice required something more: the wisdom to look deeper and the courage to admit when you've been wrong. 1 week after his encounter with Dr. Bennett, Judge Harrison's courtroom looked very different. He had rearranged the space, moving the defendant's podium closer to his bench to create a more equal environment. New signs in multiple languages welcomed visitors, and he had insisted on having a cultural heritage display installed in the waiting area. Today was special. He had scheduled a public hearing, and the courtroom was packed with local media, community leaders, and curious citizens. Dr. Bennett sat in the front row, her presence both supporting and challenging him to follow through with his promises of change. "Before we begin today's regular cases," Judge Harrison announced, his voice carrying clearly through the room, "I want to address something important." He removed his reading glasses and looked directly at the gathered crowd. "Last week, I made a serious error in this courtroom. I allowed my prejudices to cloud my judgment, and in doing so, I nearly interfered with crucial historical research." He glanced at Dr. Bennett. "This incident forced me to examine my behavior not just on that day, but throughout my career." The room was silent. Several reporters leaned forward, their pens poised above notepads. Mrs. Rodriguez smiled encouragingly from her clerk's desk. "I've spent the past week reviewing hundreds of my past cases," he continued. "What I found disturbed me. My sentencing patterns showed clear bias. My treatment of defendants varied based on their race, gender, and social status. This is unacceptable in any court, but especially in one that promises equal justice under law." A murmur ran through the crowd. Judge Harrison stood up, stepping down from his elevated bench to stand on the same level as everyone else. "As of today, I'm implementing several changes in this courtroom. First, all defendants will receive written explanations of my decisions, including the specific factors considered. Second, we're establishing a community review board to monitor our court sentencing patterns. Third, I'm requiring myself and all court staff to complete extensive cultural competency training." Dr. Bennett nodded approvingly as he spoke. Next to her, Dr. Peterson was taking notes, documenting this moment for the Historical Society's records. But perhaps most importantly, Judge Harrison continued, "I want to extend a personal apology to Dr. Maya Bennett." He turned to face her directly. "Your work preserving our city's African American history is invaluable. My dismissive treatment of you was not only disrespectful but revealed deep-seated biases that have no place in our justice system." Dr. Bennett stood gracefully, acknowledging his words with a dignified nod. The young law student who had witnessed the original incident was now frantically typing on her laptop, recording every word. "To support Dr. Bennett's work, I'm announcing the creation of the Cedar Street Historical Preservation Fund. I'm personally donating the first $10,000 to help document and protect sites connected to the Underground Railroad in our city." Applause broke out in the courtroom. Judge Harrison raised his hand for silence. "But money alone isn't enough. We need to change how we think and act. Starting next month, this courthouse will host monthly educational sessions about local African American history. Dr. Bennett has agreed to lead these sessions, helping us understand the rich cultural heritage that surrounds us." Mrs. Rodriguez stepped forward with a stack of papers. "Registration forms for the first session are available at the clerk's desk," she announced proudly. As the formal announcement ended and regular court business resumed, People lined up to sign up for the educational sessions. Judge Harrison watched from his bench, noticing how the atmosphere in his courtroom had already changed. The rigid formality had been replaced by something more human, more real. Dr. Bennett approached him during the break. "Change isn't easy, Your Honor," she said quietly. "But acknowledging the need for it is the first step. You've taken that step publicly and decisively." Judge Harrison nodded thoughtfully. "This is just the beginning," he replied. "We have a lot of work to do to make this court truly just for everyone." Outside the courthouse, the morning sun illuminated the old buildings of Cedar Street, their brick facades holding countless untold stories. Stories that, thanks to Dr. Bennett's work and Judge Harrison's awakening, would finally be heard and preserved. 3 months after Judge Harrison's public apology, the old courthouse buzzed with a different kind of energy. The building's grand entrance hall had been transformed into a temporary museum, displaying photographs and artifacts from Dr. Bennett's research. School groups moved quietly through the space, their young faces filled with wonder as they learned about their city's role in the Underground Railroad. Today was particularly special. The courthouse was hosting its third monthly educational session, but this time, high-ranking judges from across the state had come to observe what the local papers were calling the Harrison Bennett Initiative. Dr. Bennett stood at the front of the packed courtroom, now converted into a lecture space. Behind her, a large screen showed images of the Cedar Street house's hidden passages and marking systems. But it wasn't just the physical evidence she was sharing. She was teaching the audience about the human stories behind each artifact. "These weren't just escape routes," she explained, pointing to a detailed map. "They were paths to freedom, created by ordinary people who risked everything to help others. The same courage that built these hidden rooms needs to live on in our institutions today." Judge Harrison sat in the front row, taking notes just like everyone else. He had attended every session, often asking questions that encouraged deeper discussions about justice and equality. His daughter Sarah, who had flown in for this special session, sat beside him, occasionally squeezing his hand with pride. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had been instrumental in organizing these events, moved through the crowd distributing information packets. She had recently been promoted to Director of Community Outreach, a new position created specifically to build stronger connections between the court and the public. "The changes in this courthouse aren't just symbolic," Dr. Bennett continued. "Judge Harrison's review of past cases has led to the creation of new guidelines for ensuring fair treatment in courts across our state. Several other jurisdictions are now implementing similar programs." In the back of the room, the young law student who had witnessed the original confrontation was now leading a study group of fellow students. They were analyzing how historical understanding could improve modern legal practice. Their professor had turned the Harrison Bennett case into a required course, Study on Bias in the Justice System. During the break, Judge Harrison overheard two of his colleagues discussing the changes in their own courtrooms. "I've started giving everyone extra time to explain their situations," one said. "You never know what story you might miss if you rush to judgment." The local media had picked up on the story too. A documentary crew was filming today's session for a special report on transforming justice systems. They captured the moment when a group of community elders shared their own family histories of resistance and resilience. Dr. Peterson, who had played such a crucial role in that first courtroom encounter, now served on the newly formed Community Review Board. He watched with satisfaction as judges and citizens engaged in open dialogue about making the legal system more equitable. "The most powerful change," Dr. Bennett told the audience, "is in how people see each other. Every person who walks into this courthouse has a story, has value, has something to contribute to our community's understanding." Judge Harrison stood up to add his perspective. 3 months ago, I thought I knew what justice looked like," he said. "Now I understand that true justice requires us to look deeper, to listen better, and to acknowledge our own biases." Dr. Bennett didn't just teach me about history, she taught me how to be a better judge. As the session ended, people lingered to talk, share stories, and sign up for future events. The courthouse steps, once a place of anxiety for many, had become a gathering spot for community connection and learning. Sarah hugged her father as they watched the crowd disperse. "You've started something important here, Dad," she said softly. "Something that could change how justice works in our whole state." Judge Harrison smiled, watching Dr. Bennett engage with a group of eager students. "No," he corrected gently, "we've all started something together. and this is just the beginning. 1 year had passed since that fateful morning in courtroom 304. The Cedar Street house now stood as a protected historical site, its restored facade bearing a bronze plaque that told its story to all who passed by, but the real changes went far beyond that single building. Judge Harrison stood at a podium in the state's largest legal conference center, facing an audience of over 500 judges, lawyers, and legal professionals. The banner behind him read, Annual Justice Reform Conference, Building Equitable Courts. Next to him sat Dr. Bennett, now a regular speaker at judicial training programs across the country. A year ago, Judge Harrison began, his voice steady and clear. I was a different kind of judge. I thought efficiency was the same thing as justice. I thought quick decisions were always good decisions. And most dangerously, I thought I had no biases to examine. The audience listened intently. Many had already implemented versions of the Harrison-Bennett initiative in their own courtrooms. Others were here to learn how they could start. But then, he continued, gesturing to Dr. Bennett, I met someone who showed me that true justice requires us to look deeper, to listen longer, and to learn constantly. What began as a simple traffic violation became a lesson that transformed not just my courtroom, but our entire judicial system. Dr. Bennett stepped up to share the latest results of their work. In the past year, we've documented 27 more historical sites in our city alone. But more importantly, we've seen dramatic changes in how our courts serve the community. She clicked through slides showing the statistics. Complaint rates down by 60%, community satisfaction up by 70%, and a significant reduction in sentencing disparities across racial and socioeconomic lines. Mrs. Rodriguez, now the State Director of Court Community Relations, presented next. We trained over 200 court officials in cultural competency, she reported proudly. Every courthouse in our state now has a community review board and regular educational programs. The young law student who had witnessed the original incident was there too, now a newly graduated lawyer. She had just accepted a position with the Justice Reform Initiative, a program that Judge Harrison and Dr. Bennett had helped create. During the lunch break, Sarah Harrison hugged her father. Remember when we could barely talk about these issues? She asked with a smile. Now look at you, teaching other judges about confronting bias. Judge Harrison looked around the busy conference hall. He saw judges engaged in deep conversations with community leaders, court officials exchanging ideas about making their systems more equitable, and young lawyers eagerly learning from both. The Cedar Street house taught us something valuable, Dr. Bennett said, joining them. Just as the Underground Railroad worked because people chose to help others find freedom, our justice system works best when we help each other see the truth, especially about ourselves. Back in their city, the courthouse had become a model for others to follow. The waiting room now displayed a timeline of local African American history. Monthly community forums allowed citizens to speak directly with judges about their concerns. Every new judge went through extensive training about bias and cultural awareness. That afternoon, Judge Harrison and Dr. Bennett led a workshop together, sharing their story one more time. But now it wasn't just their story, it belonged to everyone who had been part of the change. Remember, Judge Harrison told the workshop participants, it's never too late to learn, to change, to do better. 1 year ago, I almost let my prejudices prevent important historical research. Today, we're building a justice system that truly serves everyone. As the conference ended, people lined up to thank them and share their own stories of transformation. Dr. Bennett's latest book, Justice Begins with Listening, had already become required reading in law schools across the country. Outside, the setting sun painted the sky in beautiful colors. Judge Harrison and Dr. Bennett stood on the conference center steps, watching people leave with new ideas and renewed purpose. We've come a long way, Dr. Bennett said thoughtfully. Yes, Judge Harrison agreed. The best part is knowing that this is still just the beginning.